All right.
All right, let me start first off the bat. I want to once again welcome Brian McGough, who's been with us, basically our professor, and has organized so many of these phenomenal speakers. We've enjoyed it through the month of September. And for our last one today, I'll let Brian introduce our special guest.
I don't know if I'll do her justice. So guys, just real quick. So this is the final building block of the class. So after this, we're going to start the ideation and practical work of your projects, whether they're product ideas or company ideas. We are honored today with Nancy Hensley. I've known Nancy for many, many years, and she has had a fantastic career in analytics and data and AI now, and now professional sports team ownership. So she is really taking all of the things that we've been learning about in the last few weeks and putting them to good practical use, which is the topic of today's discussion. I met Nancy when she was an executive at IBM many years ago, and had the pleasure of working with her for a long time and did a lot of really great projects together. She went off on her own and followed her passion for sports and AI and analytics, was the chief product officer and the chief marketing officer for one of the largest professional sports. And I think you guys stats performed as collegiate too, right? College sports analytics companies, which she'll tell us about. And in the time that she said yes to participate in this class with us, she has left to go follow a new dream, which I'm going to let her tell us about. It's very exciting, where she's going to be, again, using data and analytics. Instead of just measuring things, she's going to use it, I believe, to go acquire professional sports teams in the UK and Latin America. But Nancy, why don't you go ahead and take it from there?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Brian, for the nice intro. I'm happy to be here. Let me pull up my slides because I do have an intro slide. Let's make sure that this works. Sure. Host disabled the participation screen sharing.
All right, here we go.
Our IT guy, John, he's asleep at the wheel.
You got to allow her to share the screen.
What I have to share
over on the attendees.
All right, somebody come up when they're doing.
Yeah,
I'm guessing that's John's screen. That's right.
Yeah. Pretty cool.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Right. Make her co-host for that.
Yeah, just have it so she hosts. Yeah.
All right, says I'm the host now, so
excellent.
Let's see if I can do this. All right, did that work?
Perfect.
All right, let me put it in PowerPoint mode here. Is it gonna work? Ooh. Okay. Wow, that's a big screen. Okay. All right. So now if I can get to switch slides. Okay. All right. This is where we're talking about. So a little bit about me. Nancy Hensley. I am right now, as Brian said, a founding member of a company called Mercury13. Which I'll explain in a second. But just to give you a little bit about my background, I've spent a lot of years, I've known Brian for a long time, in the tech industry. Almost my entire career has been focused around data and AI. I actually fell in love with analytics in my time working at McDonald's. Come to find out that we made money at McDonald's not through burgers, but through how we acquired real estate. And so we were very ahead of our curve in creating a model around looking at how to acquire the right patch of real estate for a McDonald's store. So we were on the bleeding edge of spatial computing back then. That's really where I fell in love with how much data could actually change how a company does things. And then I went on to spend 2 decades at IBM, all in the data and AI business. I did everything from marketing leadership to product leadership to working development, working with a Toronto lab. And then my last role was chief digital officer, which I was really doing more digital transformation around products, like making them easier to find and download and use, and using all sorts of new growth hacking techniques to transform sort of some of our portfolio. And then in 2020, I jumped over into a role as a CPMO at Stats Perform. As Brian said, it's one of the largest sports data and AI companies. It was based here in Chicago. And I jumped in about 3 weeks before COVID hit, and absolutely all sports stopped. So here I was after 20 years of being in the same place and thought, well, this is a great time to jump into sports. But we did some really cool things, and I got to indulge my love of both sports and analytics at the same time, which is great. And then just very recently in August, I started working with some of my friends to develop this new company called Mercury13. And if those of you don't know the story of Mercury13, there were 13 women astronauts back in the late 60s that actually passed all of the tests to go to the moon. So the same as all of the original team of astronauts that went to the moon. The doctor that put them through the paces of all the stress testing and the physical testing was fascinated by what a woman might be able to do in those circumstances. And so he actually tested these women, and 13 of them made them through, got super excited, went to NASA and said, look at these results. These women, like, in some cases did better than the men. And NASA was like, oh, no, we can't have that. So it was actually canceled by the president of the United States. And so those women missed their moonshot. That was the inspiration for the name for the company. What we put together, which is we're just focused on going and investing in women's soccer or women's football, primarily in Europe, where there are massive equity and resource issues for those women, and for what they have to do to be professional players is pretty crazy. So we're looking at really challenging the ownership model and bringing a lot more equity and parity to the sport as much as we can. I'm here based in Chicago, and I definitely identify as a sports and data nerd pretty much every day of my life. So we're going to jump right in. All right, so first let's talk about the influence of sports, because everybody knows sports has this great influence. I love this quote from Nelson Mandela. It has the power to really, really unite the world. And so doing that, it can cross all sorts of barriers. And one of the stories I love was recently meeting some of the team from Angel City, which is a football team out west. And there were players that came and didn't even know how to speak English, but yet they could seamlessly play together. So whether you're a fan or whether you're on a team, sports has the power to really unite people past all sorts of barriers. But it also has a really huge influence in terms of the economic value that it has. And I don't know if you guys know, I was actually surprised when I first jumped into the sports industry to hear that it actually contributes to 1% of the GDP. I mean, that's pretty significant. So it's not just important to us emotionally, but it's also important to us financially. And when you look at like what are people watching across the world, soccer or football, whatever you call it, sometimes you'll hear me call it either one, is the biggest sport by far. And it's watched in over 200 countries around the world. Cricket is the second biggest. You'll notice what's interesting is if you look at number 10, which is American football, which is the same with NFL and NCAA football, which is the same number of viewers as rugby. But for American football, most of those viewers are just based in the US, where you see a lot of the other sports have multiple continents that they are actually have a lot of fans on. I think that's really interesting. Rugby and soccer actually have shared root system back in the UK. And there was an argument about whether you could or couldn't use your hands when they were developing the rules from the FA back in the 1860s, around 1863. And so they kind of split off. And the people who wanted to use their hands to play the game started the National Rugby League, and the people who wanted to use their feet were a part of the FA. So those are very shared roots. But a lot of the older stadiums in the UK, for example, like the one where the first team that we're acquiring is at, have their roots as cricket fields. So our stadium, they've been playing football or soccer, had it since 1880s, but it went back to the 1700s as a cricket stadium. So all these sports started very, very early, but have a strong, passionate following. And the other thing that's driving a lot of the financial benefits around sports right now, as you can probably guess, is sports betting. And the numbers there are just staggering. It's up 63%. And as the US opens, that's going to get more and more so. The US hit records just in this past year. That's actually driving a lot of revenue into local businesses, into local communities. So there are some good things about it. There are also some challenges about sports betting, as you probably all know.
Nancy, I should point out that Danville, Virginia is getting one of the largest casinos on the East Coast. It's under construction right now.
Oh, wow.
The economy of Danville will change significantly and already started a little bit as that gets implemented.
It's really interesting to see the difference in culture around sports betting in Europe versus the US. And I'll talk a little about that when we talk about some of the data and the way it's being used. But in the more advanced markets like Europe, there's a lot more attention to responsible gambling and the challenges of it, because it's just been established as a much more mature business for so much longer. Here in the US, as things are opening up, we're kind of enjoying that influx of cash to the local communities and to all the things that we wanted to do, but didn't have the money to fund them in local governments. And we haven't hit that point yet. But I think it's really important that the sports books continue to focus on that as well as this growth occurs. Anyway, all right. So one of the things I think that you'll see that flows through sports is data. To me, it's like the DNA of sports, because it flows through so many aspects of the ecosystem, and it really helps us connect the consumers of sport in a very relevant and emotional way. So whether you're watching a game or whether you're looking at something in a sports book, it's all being really run with data as kind of the fuel behind it all. And I want to talk about a couple of things of how data and AI is being leveraged and monetized in sports today. We're going to touch on a couple of these, but just at a high level. So sports books, all of the data that flows into that sports book is being collected by a sports company like Stats Perform or Genius Sports. It's either collected physically in a stadium, and for the sports books themselves, they have people sitting there using iPads with the fastest hands I've ever seen in my life, actually pushing that data in sub-second response time directly into the sports books. But it's also being used by what we call the traders in the sports books, and they're using data to create odds or markets so that they can make offers about games, and they can kind of manage the betting for the sports book. Obviously, they don't want to lose a lot of money. So there's a lot of data and AI or parts of organization in sports books. They are totally dependent on having not just data and really good predictions, but the best, right? Their business depends on it. Media depends on a lot for content and publications. And going back to the sports books for a second, when I first joined Stats Perform and I was looking at our sportsbook clients, I was amazed that they didn't have any content. They didn't have any predictions. They didn't have any data. Like, they just had offers, right? And it looked like a big Excel spreadsheet. That has changed significantly in the last few years. Content has become really, really important to them. And a lot of it's because betting and media have started to merge in the last few years, more so here in the US than in Europe, but we're starting to see it more digitally in Europe. So a lot of the media content for digital publications really depends on some really good stats and information and predictions. And it also has changed the way we tell stories in terms of the matches. Like, we talk about different kinds of metrics. We put integrate metrics onto the screen, and we'll talk about a couple examples of that. We use AI technology like natural language and generative AI to run across data and create automated match day reports and recaps. So we don't even have reporters doing that anymore. We just use Gen AI or NLG to generate that report for a lot of the publications. That way they can do it at scale and through multiple languages. So they can cover much more content than before. Data has been infused in different viewing experiences for the first time in a long time, or for the first time, viewing sports has really, really changed in the last few years. So if you look at the bottom right, you see like the screen has an L bar. So you're seeing more and more of this, where you see the data directly on the screen. And there's a reason for that. I'll cover that in a second, because it's based on how we as fans are consuming sport very differently. Data is also behind a lot of what we're doing in fan engagement. So you see a couple of social graphics here on the screen. Social's become a huge way for us to connect with fans, but what they want is a lot of content. They want things like win probability. They want to know matchup scores. They want to know final scores. So that is behind a lot of what you see, either leading up to the game or on match day or even post-match. Fantasy gaming. Recently, if anybody plays FIFA, FIFA 24 actually has stats perform data in it now for the first time. So real professionally produced data is now actually integrated into the FIFA game. Game strategy or opposition planning, recruiting and drafting. We're going to cover some, I'm going to show you some visualizations. I put a lot of pictures in because I think it's a lot easier to do that. Athlete and team performance, social media, and then brand and sponsorship. So like you see, Spotify has their brand on that social graphic. That gives them a chance to basically take advantage of global viewers of a specific sport or event, or even extend their brand to an audience that they know loves this. I have a funny story about a company that we worked with that was trying to build their brand in Indonesia. And so they knew that the Indonesian market, and it was a dandruff shampoo, and they knew that the Indonesian market really, really loved Premier League football. And so when the season started, they started to run this campaign with a bunch of stats in a social graphic. And then they put Ronaldo on the front of the shampoo bottle. And it was this wildly successful campaign. And now they basically reach 14 million new clients just by connecting them with the things that they love, which was football. So kind of a fun little story. But the reason why you're seeing many more of the data infused into the viewing experience is because how we view sports is dramatically changed over the last few years. And so when you look at this, you see that, hang on, let me move the top of my screen so I can, there we go. All right. So you can see that as we have the different ages of fans, like we started off with the age of the local fan, the early years of sports, where they were really just consuming sports as a spectator. They followed teams religiously, but they might listen to it on the radio or watch it on TV and read about it in the newspaper. And then we started to evolve with this new age of a global fan. So the global fan now didn't just involve themselves with teams, but they also started to become more multi-sported with leagues. So they, like myself, I'm a hockey fan, I'm a soccer fan, I'm a NFL fan, I'm an NCAA fan, right? I follow multiple leagues, right? So it became more global, and I follow teams around the world. That helped us because now with the introduction of cable and OTT, we had access to more sports. And now we're actually into this new age where we in sports refer to it as the fluid fan. And the fluid fan has a little bit different way of consuming sports. They like more highlights. They use more social media. They always have their phone in their hands. They're much more dynamic about the teams and the sports that they watch. So they will move between multiple teams and leagues, and they more closely follow athletes. So they identify and align with athletes even more so than teams. And so when you look across how sports is actually monetized, through whether we solely depended on putting people in stadiums, to now we've got to think about very differently about how we work across all these different fans. And by the way, this is a big challenge for a lot of sports teams because you now have fans that cross all three of these, and to try and figure out how to manage that has been a huge challenge for a lot of teams, because they have to be multimedia focused, but they can't forget that local fan. So it's pretty interesting to watch this, but this But knowing this, though, you also know that these fans consume sports differently and they want much more data and statistics. And I'll show you a little bit more around that in a second here. So here is another example of how fans are consuming data. So that it's not just around game day, but lots of fans, about 43% of them, start to seek information, mostly on social media, on the days leading up to the match. So you can see lots of different examples here of content-rich graphics that fans start to seek out. Then on game day, there's multiple ways now where different sports organizations are looking to engage the sports fan with new graphics and data and predictions that are embedded directly into their viewing experience, both on screen and in physically. Now in some stadiums, they have screens embedded into the stadiums. And then after the game, people are looking for more data around what happened and how was that matchup and, you know, what were the final stats of the game. So there continues to be this constant press for more information and content all around sports. So you can see data is flowing through this entire process, pre-game, during the game, and then after the game. And then in the press box, talk about it in the press box, did you ever wonder how these guys came up with these great stats and knew so much about what they were talking about? Well, I'll give you a little hint. They did not. In the press box, a couple things were going on. So one is, you can see there's multiple people in that press box. When I was at Stats Perform, we had at least 2 people in the press box. And most nights we had somebody that was on Slack or directly embedded into our press box live experience, which I'll talk about in a second, that was feeding this content to the producer, who was then feeding it to the broadcaster themselves. So they weren't as brilliant as you think. So as you see the screen on the right, that was a tool we developed a few years ago called Pressbox Live. And it was basically consolidating all of the data and graphics and content into one place, and it would develop live. So that stream that you see there that talked about, that shows all the events, and then there's insights on top of those events, that stream is running live. So it'll when an event happens, it'll actually also create an insight. AI will create an insight based on that event. And those are the kind of really cool things that the broadcaster says that you're like, gosh, how did they know that? Right? The secret is they have this dashboard. Now, when they get really stumped and they really need a quick answer, like when's the last time this happened, then they could actually directly go to somebody online and ask that question. So now you know the secret of what happens behind the press box. So let's talk about that different kind of viewing experience. And I always find this really, really interesting, is that when it comes to what sports fans want, it's very different based on the age range. So if you're Generation Z, right, you definitely like much more data and statistics embedded into your viewing experience in real time. There are the millennials like different camera angles. So does Generation Z. If the older generation does not, right? So you can see the difference between what the boomers like with their sports viewing experience versus the younger generation of sports viewers, which makes it really, really interesting. There actually is a big push even to do things like integrated betting, which is those capabilities are just starting to come into market. Integrated shopping capabilities, like you see a jersey, you press on it. I think Google started to introduce something similar to that, and you can search for it. Just making it really immersive as a sports experience. But to me, it's always interesting to see like what age range likes what kind of experience. I remember when I put on the Prime Vision experience the first time, my husband was in the room, and I was like, this is so cool. This is so awesome. And he was like, nope, not for me. Immediately went downstairs, watched it in the man cave, didn't want any data on his screen. So but it is something that's been driving a lot of the new fan base. All right, excuse this picture because I took it from my TV, so the quality of it isn't great, but this is just another example of an on-screen data immersed experience. And I took this on Sunday. This was the Live Golf tournament. And what's funny about golf, I think, is my husband calls it the best sport to snore to. So he basically takes a nap in sport. This is the challenge with a lot of sports is that there's a distracted audience, not the person who's taking a nap like my husband, but 84% of adults have this in their hand while they're watching sports because they're either looking up stats or they're doing something. And so there's this challenge of how do I engage the distracted audience? And if I put more information on the screen in a sport that to me is extremely boring to watch, like golf on TV, then maybe it makes it a much more engaging experience. In the case of Live actually, their tournament is very different. They go in teams and it's a shotgun start. So to me, this is actually nice to have this kind of information because it's a very different way to watch golf. This is a new startup company that's running this production. It's called Tagboard. And I actually think it's a really cool way to introduce the way they run these tournaments. Here's a few more examples. The top one on the right, this is Prime Vision. I think it's great that they actually give you a couple ways to watch it. The bottom right is actually something I worked on at Stats Perform right before I had left. It's called Optivision. And these are really advanced metrics that are embedded into the screen. They're near real time. These aren't real time because it actually takes time to run the models on these things. So they're showing you what is the expected pass to this person, what's the expected threat. And it's just a really great way to tell stories. So using metrics and advanced data to tell stories has become really important to the broadcasters. It helps them kind of stand out. The bottom left is another form of computer vision capabilities that's actually embedding graphics and predictions right into the screen itself. Again, most of these are near real time. It's very difficult to do this in real time because you have to collect the model, you have to run the data, but we're getting closer and closer with a lot more computing power. We talked a little bit about sports betting. And sports betting, there is a huge difference here in the US than there is overseas. But in the US, we actually have a lot of content, whether it's predictions and data, odds, embedded into viewing experiences and streaming experiences right in the sports books. That is not the case in Europe. They're not allowed to do that. So people from Europe come over and see all the pregame shows like the one you see here on the screen, and we're like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. But the bettors here who have grown up with fantasy are expecting a lot of data and stats as a part of their experience because that's how we grew up. We all grew up playing fantasy football and fantasy baseball. And so we're used to making these kinds of decisions based on data. Now, that's how we expect our betting experience to be as well. The bottom left, you see, this is, like I said, this is more of an immersive streaming experience. This allows you to actually create a bet slip right within the streaming experience. So this was a brand new product that actually just got announced this week. And then, of course, we got to talk about AR and VR because that also is leveraging data in many ways. A lot of the things that we had developed either for Web3 or for VR experiences for some of the partners we worked with was really based on your ability to kind of be able to look around and see specific statistics on players, different camera angles, and be able to drive into some of these statistics. This to me is always very interesting. I see sport as very, very social. So slapping a big thing on my face doesn't seem very social to me. But I do think there are some really interesting experiences that can be had, like in terms of, if you wanted to have a more data enriched experience and you just put it on for that reason, if you wanted to have a different kind of camera view, augmented reality as well. There are stadiums that now you can bring your phone in, mostly in Europe. You can hold your phone up over the field and you can see an overview of some of the statistics on the players themselves, which I think is pretty cool. There are also some stadiums where you can use your phone to get a different camera angle. So most of the stadiums are equipped with optical tracking cameras that are pulling tracking data out from the athletes themselves. They now are using those to give you different camera angles. So if you're on the far end of the field, you can actually see the other side using your phone. So those kind of experiences I think are really cool. But again, we talked about the fact that a lot of people have their phone in their hand, how to use this as an effective second screen, but still keep within the experience is a huge challenge. Any questions so far? I know I'm running through a lot of stuff. Nope.
Go ahead, Fred. We got one.
Okay, go ahead.
All right.
Say who we are.
I'm Fred from the men's golf team, and we have a lot of golfers in here today.
Golf is only boring to watch on TV. It's not boring as a sport. I just have to clarify that.
No, we're going to lose them.
I don't know if you're going to touch on it, but this part we've been talking about a lot about the viewer experience, which is obviously what's going to bring in the money. But I don't know if you're going to touch on it. But how is it AI and everything touching the actual playing of the sports?
So in terms of performance, which we're going to talk a little bit about right now, and I don't have a lot on the golf side, but AI is used a lot to actually predict performance or to help from injury management perspective or to do opposition planning. Golf is probably the one sport where it's been a little bit later to embrace a lot of these things. You're just starting to see trackers into golf balls. So when I showed you that, let me go back to this for a second. This view right here. So there's a tracker in the ball. So when he hit the ball, it's actually, the ball is tracking. That's how you're getting all of that data. Now, all of that is consolidated then, and it can be fed back to that player for feedback on their performance. Did he go straight? Did he slice it? How far did he go with different types of clubs? That is today, right? But I would say out of all the sports, golf was probably the latest to embrace AI. When you think about watching golf on TV, it didn't look like this a year ago, right? It's become much more data focused, and that's been probably one of the reasons is new organizations like LIV has been pushing innovation in a much different way than the PGA was ready to do it. They were much more traditional. It was the same thing in baseball when Moneyball started, which we'll talk about in a minute. There was a lot of resistance to it in traditional sports that have been around for a long time. People don't always embrace the technology side of it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yes.
And sorry, I don't want you to think I think golf is boring. I think watching it on TV is, though. All right. Any other questions?
They're shy.
You can always type them in the chat too. We'll get them to you after if you prefer.
Did anybody watch the LIV Golf tournament on Sunday?
A little bit.
Fans.
Yeah. What? Oh, PGA event. Well, they're merging now. So I actually watched it just because I know the people at Tagboard and I wanted to see what they were doing on screen to create these graphics. Because I do think that it is part of the way to help engage more people to the game, especially if they're doing things slightly different like LIV Golf is. So you might see PGA embracing more of that since they're merging now. I'm not exactly how sure they're going to merge, but they are merging. All right, so let's talk about data and AI from a team and player perspective. So a couple of key focus areas where data and AI is used. Recruitment and drafts is a big part of it. 80% of the operating costs for most teams are players. So this is a big focus area. Game analysis and opposition planning, also a big focus area. And then some of the newer areas where we're looking at data and AI has been around holistic player development and training. When I say holistic, it's more around being able to combine not just the performance data that they might get from a wearable, but also their mental and physical health together to make sure they're optimally performing. Injury management and prevention, and there's some really cool things happening in that space, but for those of us in soccer, for example, that's a huge thing. Female soccer players are 6 times more likely to get an ACL tear. And so that's a pretty large hit to our roster when that happens. And it's unpredictable since it's non-contact and we just don't really know the answers for how to manage that yet. So I'm going to play a video. I think it should work. But I want to not play the sound. So there's some tactics in here I want to show you. So I think a video is the best way to do it. So let me get to the point where, let's see if it's going to play. Let me turn the sound off. We don't need the sound. Okay. All right. So we'll get to the beginning here. There's just a couple of different ways that AI is used for opposition planning, and metrics are used to look at how we play that I want to show you here. So here's the first one. So line breaking passes. Line breaking passes is used. So there's two ways we look at soccer. Sorry, and I'm talking a lot of soccer. I know there's a lot of different sports in the room, but I talk a lot of soccer. There's two ways we look at measuring soccer or managing soccer. One is managing chaos so that we can create opportunity or space. The other one is to actually be able to break through and create opportunities to goals. So managing chaos and creating opportunity. So line breaking passes measures a player ability to actually break through a line of defense and create an opportunity to score a goal. So that's what you see animating right here. So obviously a player with really good line breaking passes scores allows us to pick the right person on our roster that can help us create the most opportunity and compare those. Ball received space is about that managing chaos, right? How do I effectively scan and make space to actually create more opportunities on the field? Messi is the master at this, right? And he's always under pressure. Under pressure is another way that we look at how an athlete performs. There's all sorts of metrics, but these are some of the key ones we use in recruiting. Looking at this is more opposition planning. So this is what happens when we get a corner kick. Where are the players? When they're kicking from the left? What is this team doing, and where are they at? What's the expected opportunity? What is the expected goal when they kick from the left? How many have they done? Those are the kind of things that we see. So when they get a corner from the left, we know what to expect. When they get a corner from the right, we know what to expect. When you combine some of these metrics, then we get to see some really interesting things. So you're combining line breaking passes and on-ball value. The higher the number, or the higher in the pink, gives us a very, very valuable player, and allows us to actually, I know that went really fast, allows us to actually compare these players in ways we couldn't before. When we're looking at recruitment, we're looking at some of these metrics specifically, and we're customizing them based on what we actually need in that particular team. So there's some really advanced tools on the marketplace for us to really narrow down thousands and thousands of players just based on some super advanced metrics like those things that I just showed you. It's really hard to explain those if you don't have pictures. So, all right, we're gonna take a couple of examples that are pretty recent. So last week, Newcastle hosted AC Milan. This is something that they would have used for opposition planning. Now, I put the result in there, it's highlighted. So AC Milan had a 40% chance of winning with a 24% chance of a draw. It was a draw, by the way. But when Newcastle was doing their opposition planning, they would have looked at a map like this, because one of the challenges they had was a guy named Raphael. He had the most expected goals and assists. So they need to know, where is this guy going to play on the pitch? How do we know what he's going to do? So they would look at mappings and predictions like this that show that where he's going to be hanging out on the pitch, and where we need to make sure we provide coverage and formation from a defensive standpoint. And then this was a big game this week. If you do love soccer, you probably tuned into Arsenal versus Tottenham. This was the big London derby of the week. And what this shows is this. Now this would be post-game analysis. So what happened? So in the first part of the game, Arsenal pressed very high. So you can see that map in the first part, and you can see where they were under pressure. And the second half of the match, that actually loosened up, and Tottenham was able to play through a little bit more. That one also ended in a draw. But these visualizations are so important to the teams because they're not only going to look at how are we going to play on the pitch, but also they're going to look at them afterwards in terms of what happened and how do we do better in the future. All that is based on predictive AI. Now, in terms of recruiting, I'm sure everybody's watched Moneyball. The Moneyball really challenged the old way of recruiting, right? So it used to be that they would just look at a couple of things. They would look at hitting for power, running, fielding, and throwing. And I don't know if you guys remember that when one of the guys in this scene said, and he looks good in a uniform. But when Bill James wrote the baseball abstracts back in 1981, his theory was that one of his theories was if you got more people on base, you could win more games. So you could go recruit the person who gets walked the most and you'll have a better result. And everybody thought he was nuts. So he wrote the baseball abstracts in 1981. It wasn't until the early 2000s, I think it was 2001, that Billy Beane actually said, you know what? We don't have any budget. So I'm going to try this and see if it works. So I'm going to use these statistics. And I'm going to try out this theory. And of course, you guys know the story that that absolutely did work. So recruiting has changed significantly. And a lot of the roots of that started in baseball. I'm going to show you how single metrics, when you're looking at drafting a player, doesn't really tell you the whole score. So if you look at these two players, they both have very similar scores. And if you just look at their points per game, they also look really similar. But what's different about these two are their style of play and some of their efficiency, like at the free throw line. These are really important levels of detail. And this is the same thing in soccer, where you can't just look at base stats to really understand if that person's going to fit in on your team the way you need them to fit in. So there's a lot more deeper data that goes into recruiting that's really, really, really important. I mean, you think about, you're making these multi-million-dollar decisions. You're not going to just base it on some metrics on a sheet, right? But you can't always be everywhere. So you need data. What this does as in soccer is it helps really accelerate the time that it takes to actually get through thousands of players and really narrow down based on what you specifically need in your team. In soccer, we would have models that would run that could run through like thousands of players and narrow down to specifically somebody that has the metrics that you want, that plays on the pitch how you want. That would have taken 40, 50 hours of looking at video at least, maybe more, to actually get to the same point. So AI has really helped accelerate that. But then the question is what happens when you're looking at somebody in the draft, in the NFL, NBA draft, for example, where there is no data collected? And that created an interesting problem that we set out to solve a few years ago when I was at Stats Perform. So in the NBA, started looking at people in the international markets. And even in some NCAA teams, there wasn't always video and there wasn't always enough data around these players. Now, think about it. You're making these multi-million-dollar decisions about these players. Your season rests on you making the right decision. So what do? So we actually use computer vision to go back and pull data using body pose and player IDs and all sorts of modeling with computer vision to pull all that data out from the video. So we could go back to games that Michael Jordan played and compare players against Michael Jordan. So they gave us like a time machine to go back and use video to create this data for the NBA and players that they didn't have this depth of data. They were used to having, like, we looked at that synergy data that I showed you. They did not have that for maybe half of the draft picks that they wanted to take. So that made a lot of the data scientists and front office pretty nervous. Now with computer vision, we could actually create that data.
Hey, Nancy.
Uh-huh.
Can we take, you and I kind of grew up as data science was evolving. So we tend to know things inherently. So I just want to cover one thing. The idea of a predictive model, and again, I apologize if this is rudimentary for you guys in the room, but the idea of a predictive model is looking at the amount of the more data we can look at, the historical data, and it doesn't really matter what it is, looking at exactly what happened, what the outcome was, determines the strength of the predictive model. So the more data we feed it in order to say Michael Jordan behaved this way, had this outcome, so we know that if we have other players who behave this way, this should be the outcome. And if it's not, we can look and see what was different and what changed. And again, that's how we build the strength. So the big part of these, as Nancy was talking about data early on, is the best predictive models, the best AI engines are going to have the most data and the most accurate data. And that's why we talked a little bit with Josh, I think it was last week, we talked about the quality of data. We want to make sure that that's a focus as you're using digital and AI, as part of your projects or product. It's the quality of that data and the volume of it goes into directly how strong the model is and what the outcome accuracy will be.
Yep, seasons and seasons and depth of data is going to make a much better model. This is one of the challenges I'll cover on the women's side, that we lack that. But we had data that went back to the 1800s at Stats. So we had data. It was perfect. 4 decades of collecting it.
Sorry about that. Keep going. Sorry.
Oh, that's good. Thank you.
Make that quick point.
So I talked a little about, so that's a bunch of data that's focused on opposition planning. You saw recruiting, and drafting. Oh, sorry, this is a little blurry. But solutions are now shifting to really focus on the athlete themselves. And this is something that we're pushing, I'm personally pushing for, is how do we empower the athletes with their own data? So back to your question about golf, to help them improve. But what we're finding is that there's all sorts of tools out there now and ways that they can get data, and they're overwhelmed. So we're working with a bunch of solution providers that actually consolidate all of that. So if you wear an Apple Watch, it's going to pull your biometric data from your Apple Watch. If you wear an Oura Ring, it's going to pull it from there, and it's going to curate this information for you, combine your performance, your stats, and your biometric data into one place. That would be really empowering for the athletes. We're not there yet. This particular solution called Breakaway Data is getting close. It still hasn't touched enough on the mental and physical health of things right now. Like for I've talked to a lot of professional soccer players, as you can imagine. What they would tell me is that their coach would send out a questionnaire on the game day, and it would be like, how did you sleep last night? How do you feel? Like just 2 or 3 questions that they would answer. And then that was it. They didn't get any feedback beyond that. So I think we need to shift back into, how do we feed this back to the athlete? How do we help the athlete make themselves to understand how to be the most performant that they can be? And that's a trend that's recently happened. The other thing is injury management has become a real challenge. And so I don't want this to start yet. How do we use technology, especially with an injured athlete, to keep them engaged? There is a big movement around neurotraining, and this is a company out of Israel that we've started working with recently. A lot of our athletes that have ACL tears actually get depressed because they can't do anything. The theory is that whether you're injured or not injured, that there is a connection between keeping that muscle memory and using your brain to maintain that muscle memory and being able to optimize as an athlete. So this is let me play the video for you, and I'll may not hear it. Tell me if you hear it. Okay. It might just be music though, but.
Yeah, there's no sound.
So this is a tool that when an athlete is injured, they can still maintain their muscle memory. So when they actually get back on the field or on the court, their brain still has that muscle memory and neurofeedback that they need to stay at peak performance. So some really advanced technology that's happening out there that helps us leverage innovation to deal with some of the things that normally we wouldn't know how to deal with, because that athlete, especially for like an ACL tear, is literally has to stay still. And this helps them kind of maintain a positive attitude as well, because they suffer from a lot of depression while they're out injured. Go to the next one. Okay. So a couple of things about what teams need to know or what they need to leverage data and AI. First is that they have to have an open mind to being data driven. There are a lot of teams that I see that we've been working with that might even have all these tools. They might have the products that do the tracking or the wearables, but they're not actually consuming the data. So the owner, the coach at the executive level, they all have to be bought in on this being really important part of the way they operationalize their organization. They also have to understand what they specifically want to do. What's the most important thing to them? So for example, we have a team that is one promotion away from the Women's Super League. So the most important thing for us right now is really smart recruiting, right? We have to make sure that we have the right team put together so that we can actually get that promotion to the next level. That's number one for us. So it really depends on where they are. They need to understand the questions that they have and what they want to do. And then they have to commit to operationalizing that data. So it's no good to actually have all this technology and have these predictions and have the feedback if they don't know how to actually put it to use. And part of that is if they have a big data science team, that data science person or that analyst needs to be able to speak the language of the coach. So, I was showing you those heat maps and those passing maps and things like that. That's the coaches are always very visual. Being able to connect this data and content to video as well is really, really important for the coach. So being able to speak their language and be able to communicate with them is really, really important. For me, like I'm in the process of hiring a few people. I'm only hiring ex-players because that's a huge challenge that we don't have to deal with then. They also need data engineering. So there's so many disparate forms of data that we've talked about here. There's the data from a wearable that they might be wearing. There's data that might be in the ball or the golf ball, like we talked about. There's optical tracking cameras. There is stats. There's event data that comes in from the team or from the league level. All of that has to be integrated. And so having a data engineer who knows how to be able to consolidate and integrate all that data together into a data store that makes it much more usable is really, really important. A lot of teams go out there and they hire data scientists and analysts, and then they expect them to do that data engineering piece. And that doesn't always work out so great. So that's really, really, really important. Any questions on that so far? All right. I know I'm running through a lot of stuff with you guys. All right. So let's talk about the next big thing in sports. And I'm going to switch a little bit to different kinds of data. So does everybody know what this picture is? I hope.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's right. So this actually broke the world's record for women's sports events. This was a women's volleyball game in Nebraska. Pretty exciting. Women's sports as a whole has significantly grown, no matter what you're looking at, whether it's the number of people that watch Coco Gauff's final over Medvedev's, the Women's World Cup that had record viewership, the March Madness, wherever it is, the numbers have significantly jumped in the last few years. And the viewers, we talked about who the sports fans were. There's a common myth that only women view women's sports. Here's some data around that. This is a different kind of data. So as you can see, it is actually split between men and women, and they are the same fluid kind of fan, younger, more educated like yourselves, that care more about social issues, things like that. that are watching women's sports. But the biggest challenge, as you can imagine, one of the things, among things, is there is some inequities there, from the viewing time, which affects our ability to collect data, right? So if we only get 10% of sports coverage, we can't collect data. And then there's also the earnings challenges as well. That is the biggest challenge, which is data. Here's a great example. So everybody know who Sam Kerr is? Yes. So in October of 2022, a journalist from ABC, a couple journalists, actually set out to chronicle her career. And at the time, she's got more goals now, she had 238 goals. And they could only find video coverage of 19 of those goals. So you can see how she literally exploded. Like in the second half of her career, she was scoring like more than 30 goals every year since 2017. But there was no data or stats or video coverage of the early part of her career. So we were lacking data. So going back to what Brian said is a lot of these advanced statistics and methods and models that we build really depend on having that depth of data. And so we haven't had equity across all sports and all genders of sports when it comes to data. We've kind of leaned a little bit heavier into the men's sports than we have the women's sports. And this is now becoming a huge challenge for women. We don't have the coverage and we don't have the data. And that's actually a big barrier to growth to women's sports. Even though you see this explosion of growth and people filling stadiums, this to me was the reason why I joined Mercury13. This was one of the reasons, was that I could see that we needed to change that because it's so much part of how people consume sport. They want stats, they want data, they want video. And if we're not collecting it around all of the sports we love, then we're doing an injustice to that sport. All right, so a couple of takeaways and then we'll open it up for questions because I think we wanted to go an hour and then had some questions. So data is critical to so many aspects of sports, whether it's doing game analysis, whether it's recruitment, and then whether it's on the revenue side, it's important to the media, to the sports betting. That actually brings revenue into sports. You saw that there was a difference in the way people consume sports. And younger fans really want more real-time data analytics and stats as a part of their viewing experience. AI has absolutely revolutionized things like recruiting because it doesn't take the human out of the loop, but it gives that person superpowers. And so with more and more data collected, too, athletes are actually demanding more access to their data. So that has become a bigger issue over in Europe. And there were actually lawsuits that some of the players have filed against their league to actually make more money off of their data or have access to their data. So if we can empower the athletes with their own data to help their own performance, I think this is going to make a huge difference. Leveraging predictive analytics and some new innovation for injury management is going to be really impactful, especially for those of us in the field of soccer, where we're constantly managing injuries all the time. And then women's sports, had to put in my plug for that. While it's on the rise, we are really hindered by that lack of data. We don't have those years and years of data. Like what I was saying, we had data at Stats Perform that went back to the 1800s, but in women's sports, we had like a couple of seasons. So we need to bring more equity to that as a whole in our sports. All right, so I know I threw a lot at you. Let's open it up for questions.
I got a question?
I do.
All right. Sorry, our volleyball team.
No, not the volleyball team. This is a kind of an academic question. Nancy, you're right. I've been at Avery 36 years, so this is really interesting to me. But what is your definition for a data engineer?
So a data engineer is somebody who understands how to actually bring different types of data together and put it in a data lake or a data store that makes it more usable. So they're more the data integration experts. They're not the analysts, they're not the data scientists, they're not building the model, but they're building the foundation that the data scientists can then work from. Most data scientists spend 80% of their time gathering the data and making and cleaning the data and making that data usable before they can even start to see any of the cool things that you guys saw in terms of those predictions, right? Like line breaking passes or win probabilities or any things that you saw in those graphics. That's like the last part of the process. Most of it is just getting the data, making it clean, and then the data scientists can then start to work on training the models and eliminating some of the noise in the model, which is bad data. So they're a really important part. The challenges, I think, with a lot of sports teams is that they don't see that until afterwards. And so the data scientists themselves are forced to try and do both jobs, and they're not as well trained in that. It's a big challenge. And there's a lot of data coming at them.
And I can tell you, it's a unique skill. I mean, it's not something that a data scientist or an analytics person would know how to do inherently as part of their training. Data engineering is a fairly unique skill. The best example I have, Nancy, I don't know if you remember, it was a long time ago, but we did a injury prediction with the University of Kentucky men's basketball team. Remember, they were integrated Catapult, which was the wearable at the popular wearable at the time. And then we did another spinoff of that with the Philadelphia professional basketball team. And the reason those projects didn't take off, I mean, some of the insights they're getting were incredible, is because it took several months to gather and integrate all the data because they lacked that data engineering skill. And ultimately, it wasn't until they, had a large data engineering team that any of that stuff took off. That technology for injury prediction had been around a long time, but the lack of focus on data engineering and bringing in other outside data to increase the signal in the model, like weather data and sleep patterns and these things, because those rings and things didn't exist. I mean, we literally had to wire people up. It looked like they were being launched into space to gather sleep patterns. And I remember working on some of those projects, and it really wasn't until the data engineering piece got brought in that any of that stuff made sense and was able to scale effectively.
And the other challenge too is when we create these models. In the past, we used to have the data scientists all sitting in the corner. They had their own little set of data, and they would create the model, and then they would say, okay, here's the model, but how do you operationalize that? How do you actually create that so it runs live? Because that's what the sports teams need. They need real-time information, like what I was showing you, those different heat maps and things like that. That's a whole new challenge for data engineers to be able to integrate into an application that runs on demand as the event's occurring. So remember that stream that you saw in the tool the broadcasters use. When events happen, it kicks off the model to look out and say, okay, are there, can we create any interesting fact based on these events? And so it doesn't do it on every event, but if there's a combination of events that happen, the model will kick off and create an interesting insight based on that. But all of that has to be done in real time. And that is a whole other challenge for data engineering than it was even 10 years ago when we were just doing these models in static and doing post analysis and things like that.
Now, there's an upside, though. Remember, we talked about the 6 generations in the market. Generation Alpha, which are people that were born after the year 2000, have some of those data engineering skills inherently in their primary education. So things like merging simple data sources and the concept of merging data sources will be very common in the workforce for that generation and going forward. And of course, that leads to, if I were to predict just from experience, I imagine at some point in the near future, someone from that generation will develop an AI model that integrates data effectively using something like a chat GTP4 kind of model where it's able to ingest and create rules and connections.
Yeah, we shouldn't be that far away from it.
I think it's probably within 5 years, but it's pretty wild. But there is an inherent knowledge of how to integrate data sources in teenagers now because of the things that they do with their social media platforms and their music platforms and video game platforms. So whereas, the basics was a learned skill for myself and people of my generation and John's generation, it's now going to be something that's going to be a lot easier to catch on to for the newer members of the workforce.
Yeah.
Yeah, Nancy and Brian, let me introduce you to someone online here. Meg Stevens is our
our AD, and actually a Nike Women's AD of the Year for D3. And Meg, the question for you a little bit is, talk a little bit about D3 and challenges and what you see in your environment and how this could, and Nancy can, respond to that, how, what we should be looking at.
Absolutely. Well, Nancy, just on behalf of Averett, but really all the student athletes and athletic staff in particular on the screen, I can't thank you enough, right? And especially as a female in sport, female athletic directors make up less than 20% of the population, and so I can say really do appreciate everything that you're doing. I will overshare and say that my wife actually grew up in the professional leagues in Europe, and so there is I fully understand and really can make a difference. Obviously, we want the absolute best, right? At a small Division III private university, I want the best for my kids. And, they're sitting in the room and I'm sure they don't want to be kids, but they know I think about them as my kids. Whether it's, the truth is it's money driven. I want the best data for them that we can possibly give them. I want to be driven by AI. I want all of those opportunities. But right now I'm pretty stoked. I can get them a pair of sneakers every year. And we're kind of we're doing the best we can with what we have to make sure it's the best experience it can be for our student athletes and therefore for our university. How far off do you think, whether it's Division III or that it really becomes a really usable data source, or where we can really get into AI, where it becomes affordable and really make a difference?
So that's a great question. I think that the democratization to push this down to lower levels is really a big focus of professional sports, because we know that that's where our future stars are coming from. And the challenge we have, and even like at our level in women's professional soccer, if I go to all of the companies that collect sports data today, they are not collecting below the top tiers, right? And so that's not where I'm shopping for players. So it's a huge issue. There is data out there, but they aren't, it's not being used, right? It's not being leveraged. So I think there's a heightened awareness. I think as we do more to democratize data and AI, and ChatGPT is just a phenomenal example of democratization of AI, because it made it really, really easy to use. My whole career, that's been my whole focus, is how do I make things really, really easy to use so that you don't even realize it's AI, right? You just realize it's something cool and you're getting information you never had before. I think we're not too far away from it, but there has to be consistent voices, because the industry isn't set up to monetize that way. I came from it, right? We were monetized off of sports betting. But that's how we built our business cases for data collection. That's not like to say anything bad about that. That's just the way it's been working. It works against the youth sports and it works against women right now, because that's not where the betting occurs. So if we can continue to push, and that's why I think the focus on the athlete themselves, so that people start to understand how to use data to make themselves better. Even like, to me, I would love for athletes at the D3 level and the collegiate level to be able to use data to negotiate contracts when they get into the professional space, like to know enough about their data. And I think there was a player from Chelsea recently that did that, to be able to do that, because it's their data, right? And so you should be able to use it. I think we're probably on that track. We're not there yet. It's just going to take more voices to get there. And that's one of the reasons why I stepped out of the private equity owned firm to do this, because we saw this challenge on the women's side. And I think that some of the things that we do are going to help democratize it for even the lower levels of play below the professional level. It's got to happen, right? Because it's going to help all of us understand how to improve, how to prevent injury. It's so key. So I'm right there with you.
I appreciate that. And we talk to our student athletes all the time about not necessarily going pro in the sports they play, but going pro in something. But you're right. We want to win like anybody else. They know me well enough, and winning games is a piece of it. But if it can help prevent injury, we'll do anything to try to keep them healthy and keep them happy.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.
So obviously enough, Meg, I was just talking this week to a school in New Zealand, a private school, and they're volunteering their sports programs to train data, to train programs and do testing of technology for some of the companies that are becoming more ubiquitous in the market. So it's certainly one of the things I think you could do to help shortcut it and help access to some of this become easier for your programs, is to offer yourself up as a volunteer for
Nancy, consider ourselves. Averett University will be happy to be your first Division III partner. And I'm sure our student athletes in the room would be happy to do that. We have over 500 of them in 24 sports. So we would be happy to data test.
And I do think some of the solutions that are coming out on the market are trying to be more democratized. Like, I don't know if anybody saw the product from Playmaker, but it was actually developed in Chelsea. And it's just something you can strap on your boot. I'm speaking British soccer. And it measures every time you touch the ball, like things like that. But it's out on the open market. That other app that I showed you, that Breakaway app, that is also out into the open market. So I think there is a good push towards it. But we also have to educate the student athletes, right, that on why data is important and how to use it. Because making yourself much more data savvy is going to make you a better athlete.
Cool. Truthfully, I mean, we don't know, Meg, where the next technology is going to come from. It may come from a university's, tech transfer group locally or somewhere in your area. So again, it was interesting. I was asking the coach, I said, well, how did you get involved with this? He said, we just put our hand up and said, we will try anything. You want to wire us up, we'll do it. You want to have us, it's all, around real-time experiential feedback was the goal of the company. And nobody, everybody was a little hesitant to buy into it right away. And they're like, yeah, we'll do that. But we want to get all the data back for our own use. And we want to get all the next generation programs. And it was just neat to see how a small school got into a bigger pond by just saying, we're willing to participate and we'll be a good partner in doing it. I think you certainly have that chance too.
And there's a lot of sports tech startups that are focused at the college level. And I think there was something like $6 billion funneled in from private investors into the sports tech space. There's also a lot of athletes that are starting funds because they see this opportunity of, what am I going to do when I retire as an athlete? And so a lot of them are actually investing in sport tech and helping innovation move forward.
Well, cool. Other questions? Anybody? Okay. I just to throw a plug here for Meg and what she's done. We're D3. I believe the North Campus that Meg runs up there is probably one of the nicest D3 stadiums, or at least sports complexes in the country. They're as good as anybody. And we are very diversified with our sports. And then just with working with Brian and other aspects, we are also looking at campus to get to possibly net zero from a carbon output standpoint here in the next couple of months, nothing else. So we're pioneering several of those technologies. So the extent that we could, we're just demonstrable that we're open to obviously data and interesting things to lead the way, both with Meg as our athletic director, and we have Dr. Tiffany Franks, our president, who are leading those charges. So
excellent. Meg, you and I should connect on LinkedIn, because I do run into a lot of startups that are interested in working with open-minded athletic organizations, because not everyone is open-minded to this. So absolutely.
You better watch though, Meg. You already told her your wife's background. She's going to try and recruit her now.
Well, I'm sure on behalf of our student athletes, although they are welcome to speak up, we have a wonderful, wonderful bunch. But I am happy to say, I think one of the best things about Averett, whether it's other administrators or our students in the classroom, that you would be happy to know is we operate equitably. And I think that's really different. We philosophically, when we say one team, what we allow, what the way we travel, our meal per diem, our uniform rotations are equitable, whether you're on a men's or women's team, and no matter what sport you play. We really are doing sport differently. We were tired of hearing, well, this is the way it's always been done. And so very much, we were really excited to see that you were coming today, because you align in terms of technology, but also in terms of vision of what we are looking to build. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. That's amazing. Yeah. In fact, the first team that we're investing in is the only professional team in Europe, football club, that equitably split their budget between the men and the women, Lewis Football Club. And so that aligned with our principles, but we will be up against some huge challenges in Europe, as you probably know, because the women's clubs are not separate. So we don't know what we don't know yet in terms of complications, but it does need to be challenged and move forward, right? We've made some great strides here in the US, but elsewhere in the world, not so much.
All right. Any other questions? Anybody? Got a bunch of coaches and stuff. Oh, you have one more? Okay, here we go.
Yeah, well, it's Fred again. And first of all, thank you so much for everything you shared with us. And kind of one question, total different aspect. So as we know, and as you spoke of, there are so many things you can measure and get the data on, but how far are we from, or the AI from measuring like a lot of the mental stuff, like that you can't, what makes some people so good? You see, you can measure everything that happens on the field, you can measure how they sleep, how they eat, but what really goes on inside their brain? How far are we away from that?
That is a great question. So the thing that's holding us back from being able to build valid predictive models on that is data, right? So we don't have people's personal biometric data to build a bunch of models on. So that one screen that I showed you that was combining some of that stuff, that we're just getting to that place where we are trying to understand how somebody's mental health affects their physical performance by pulling that data together. It's sort of a sensitive topic, right? Because this is very, very personal data to people. Coaches use it peripherally, right? Especially on ones that I know but we're not building models off of it yet. I met with a team out of Israel this morning that is actually trying to do that. And in soccer, there's been a challenge of how do you measure somebody's ability to create space with scanning. That would actually take being able to measure their eyeball movement and some of their thought processes. It's pretty advanced stuff. But the thing that's holding us back really is the data. Once we can get more athletes to opt in and help us build models where we can combine some of that biometric data and performance data, we'll get a much better idea of how to better build those models and what we can do with it. But we're little ways away from that yet. There's some pockets of it. Some sports are very focused on it, but we're not quite there. It's not as democratized yet.
And Fred, if I may, Nancy, just to add to that point, there's and to give you some ideas as you're thinking about your projects, right? There's a fidelity issue in the data we collect via surveys. Survey data is kind of garbage, right? I mean, if you think of a structured survey, the way we started collecting data that way was because the computers that read the information required the data to be structured. That doesn't exist anymore. So that barrier, so we could collect real-time experiential data. We can collect it, in verbatim mode and free thought, but we don't. And a lot of that has to do with what I'll call big survey. There are so many companies, and they're multi-billion-dollar industry that has created this survey infrastructure for schools and governments and healthcare and everything else. They're not willing to give that up yet, but there are a lot of innovators out there that have created some very novel ways. There's not a standard yet to collect real-time experiential data from humans. And I think that as that grows, the fidelity of the information of how somebody's mental state and how they're feeling for that day will grow with it. And I just think it's a collection issue right now, and not just from the wearables and the advancement and the helmets and things, but even just having somebody tell you how they're feeling in their own words in the very moment that they want to tell you, versus sending them surveys that are, predetermined measures by others that maybe are not relevant to that person in the moment, right? So just a thought. Maybe one of the things you want to think about is how you could collect that information and get that data integrated into your models quicker. There really is a gap there still. And a lot of it has to do with, again, the lobbying efforts on these very large enterprises that make billions of dollars managing surveys.
Yeah, it's an affinity issue too, right? Because the performance data is collected in one aspect, and the biometric data and some of the other data is collected in a different tool, and they're not coming together. And some of that is GDPR challenges. My vision that I would love to have someday is for our athletes to wake up in the morning, have a natural language interface like a chat GPT that asks them like 5 questions. How did you sleep? How are you feeling? For some of our female athletes, where are you in your cycle? Because that matters for a lot of things. How many days till match day, right? And then it goes back and curates, okay, based on this is how many hours you should train. Here's the calories that you should eat and the mix of things that you should eat, right? Here's your highlights from last week. Here's your stats. Here's a heat map of your opposing team that's coming up this week. Like, just curate it all together. That would be the most ideal thing and I don't think we're that far away from it with the advancements that we have with generative AI. But it's going to take a lot of data integration work to get there.
It's coming though. You could be somebody sitting next to you, Fred, or you yourself that get us there. But it's definitely something that we need to do next, is to get to that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
I can say something else too. From an academic standpoint, we have an undergraduate minor and major in applied data analytics. We also have a master's that is in applied data analytics. And one of the things, my question is, do you have a certain program that you use? We're sitting here, the department chair, we're sitting here looking at what we could do with this program now in a sports data analytics, because we've already got most of the courses out there. And my brain's flying. And Meg, I'm looking at you, because this is something that we've had these programs here now for about 4 years or longer. And we were ahead of our time with the applied data analytics. We didn't want the data science because we couldn't afford the people at Avery, the resources with the people that would be the data scientists. But we wanted to look at it from a management side and the applied data analytics. And we've already got those programs here. And just looking at a couple of things we've been doing what we tell our students not to do. Sitting here looking at things on the computer while you're talking, because it wouldn't take much for us to slide some of our programs into this, and it would be disciplinary. But the question I'm trying to get back to, do you have a specific program that you use, like SAS or BI, any of those, or are they more specific programs and analytics that you use?
Nothing specific. I mean, the data scientists will use various methods depending on what they're trying to solve. So I wouldn't say there's anything specific. I would say that one of the things I would somehow inject into your agenda is, as you're developing applied data scientists, is that they have the ability to actually effectively story tell with that data. Yep. That's a big part of applied data science. I think that somehow we miss out. I meet so many data scientists that can really speak very deeply on the methods, but when you put them in front of a coach, the coach thinks they're a Martian. They don't understand anything they're saying. So I think that's one of the big challenges in getting success here, is to make sure that somebody can actually speak the language of the industry, in this case sports, which would be the language of the coach or the trainer or the athlete, so that they can effectively consume the outputs of what the data science team is doing. So storytelling is huge.
It's interesting, and Brian, maybe you can touch on this real quick. So for the class, our next steps, right, as we finished our lectures in September, now we've got a couple of months of figuring out what we want to do with it from a use case or whatnot. Maybe Brian, spend a minute talking about, or Nancy too, some ideas around. I mean, we have sports management folks, and we've got marketing, we've got computer science folks in the group, we have marketing. So it's that's the next step, right? How do we infuse that? Any thoughts, so they go away thinking about this?
I'll jump in ahead.
Please, go ahead. That's your first.
So you mentioned a couple different aspects. So marketing, you should be thinking about the opportunities for branding and sponsorship and how they can get involved from a sports perspective. So remember the story I told you about the dandruff shampoo? Like, who would have thought a dandruff shampoo would be a big sports sponsor? But they use it as a way to connect with their customers, right? All of those viewers that we saw in global sports are also customers. Sports management, it's more about how do I operationalize some of this information to build a better team, to build a higher performing, build a better product on the field, but also to build a better team in general, right? That includes building up the athletes and empowering the athletes with their own data. So that just kind of gives you a couple ideas from a couple different aspects.
That's awesome. I see some nodding athletes in the room.
So John, I'm going to FedEx you this folder, which has about 400 one-page descriptions of ideas for businesses. And it's from an investment group that I used to participate in, where I would basically do early angel investing in ideas. And these were everything from university students to, people my age coming up with an interesting idea. And it's just really to help stimulate some thoughts. And it ranges from, biosimilars all the way out to all kinds of funky technologies and stuff. But it's at the ideation level to give you some ideas. But the thing that I think about, and I know I've mentioned this a couple of times, the best thing to do is to how to take innovation and bring it to something that you already have a passion for. Nancy was an incredible executive in the time that I've known her, and probably long before that, because she liked what she did. She was into it. She loved the project. She loved the people, and she brought innovation and big ideas and free thinking into those things that she already enjoyed. Those are the things that are going to be successful for you. As you guys heard me say before, I spent most of my career in healthcare, right? So if I think of the best CEOs of any hospital in the world, around the world, they're people that had a passion for healthcare. Most of them were nurses originally. It used to be, and actually that's an interesting shift, Nancy, from how we've appreciated, gender roles and executive ranks. It used to be that all the CEOs of hospitals, when I started in the industry, they were all formerly surgeons and they were all men. And now we're finding that most of the best CEOs now, especially in children's hospitals, were mostly former nurses, started out their career as nurses and had an affinity for technology and brought those two things together. And most of them are women, because we found that women were able to be open to learn new things faster. Not that the men couldn't at the same pace or anything, but women tend to embrace new technology and new ideas and new concepts a little quicker. So it changed the dynamic a little bit in leadership. And I live in Philadelphia, as you guys know, and I think of Madeline Bell, who's probably one of the greatest leaders of a children's hospital around the country. And she was a floor nurse. And we had many conversations when she's bringing new innovation into Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. She's using that passion that she had for patient care and the experience she had as a floor nurse those many years ago, and bringing that to the table with the technology and with all the other innovative ideas from her staff. And I think that's what makes the difference. So I'm going to send you guys these ideas, but they're really just to give you stimulate some thoughts. I would hope that it's something that you're interested in. So that's my advice. And Nancy, I don't know if you have
something you're passionate about, yeah. Right? The whole reason why I'm in Mercury13 is because I became very passionate about bringing more equity into sport, in particular women's soccer, because somebody needed to do it. So if you're really passionate about it, it's going to show, especially when you're getting investors, it makes a huge difference.
Yeah. And you can see in what I'll send you that there are some of these people were doing it just to get money. They didn't care. They were completely checked out, and it was obvious in what they wrote up. And you can see the ones that, where the people had a passion for it. And so I'm not going to tell you which ones we invested in. So I'll let you see if you can pick them out. But that was, part of my role was to try and find the ones that had that passion and were able to easily incorporate those big ideas.
Maybe we can do that next week with students. Questions. I want to first thank Brian McGough for bringing the quality of someone like Nancy to our students. Just fantastic. And Nancy,
thank you.
A phenomenal lecture today and discussion, and Now I'll just tell you on behalf of Avert and Meg and President Franks, we'd love to have you on campus. We ever had a chance to have you come meet the students and work on some of the ideas. I think you'd be warmly welcomed, of course.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for having me and listening. And hopefully my call to action is for you guys to watch more women's sports too.
Yes.
We need all the help. We need all the viewerships. We need that equity. But also just to really educate yourselves on why data is important and to be able to understand how you use it to tell stories, whether you're going to go into media or marketing. It's the data that's going to guide you and help you make better decisions and do things that you never could do before. That's what AI is. It just gives you superpowers.
Thank you, Nancy. You're fantastic. This was incredible. Thank you very much. I learned a lot myself. It was great. Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. See you next week.
Thanks, Brian.
Mm-hmm.